Sorry, there was no recording yesterday. Just had to do some stuff around the house. Didn't quite have time to get to the commentary, but here we are again, talking about decolonization and decolonization through violence. It's going to be not necessarily the most cheerful of lessons, but still an informative one, focusing on parts of the world that really don't get enough love, especially in non-world history courses. All right, so first thing we got to do is give some background to decolonization. So if you were to warp back 120 years, you would see that most of the world that was not in Europe was controlled in some capacity by European nations. Really, the exceptions were the United States and Latin America. Almost everywhere else was monitored or sphere of influenced or colonized by European nations. But by the 1970s, almost the entire planet had achieved independence. That was really, really fast. And while the fall of empire is not really a remarkable thing, we've seen empires rise and fall through the entirety of our course. The fact that these empires decline, fall, and give rise to independent states that really haven't given way to a new empire is a really new thing in history, and it's a kind of cool event. For the next three slides, we're going to go over Europe's imperial collapses, why they happened, and why they happened when they happened. It's a pretty easy guide, but it is important to understanding what's going to take place over the course of the rest of this slideshow. So the first reason that European empires collapse is because what they were teaching, what they were selling, which was Christianity, the piety of Christianity, the philosophies of the Enlightenment, which you can thumb back and look at, the idea of progress, really did run counter to what was actually happening in their colonies, which was a combination of outright racism, not outright but still subtle racism, extreme poverty in large swaths of the colonized world, and full-on exploitation of the environment, of the people, of basically everything you can exploit. They touted themselves, especially during World War II, as the democratic forces against the evils of dictatorial fascism, but they ran their colonies as virtual dictatorships, and the nationalism spread initially by the French Revolution throughout the Mediterranean basin kind of takes place in the rest of the wider world, and you begin to see people demanding nations of their own. The other thing is timing. Again, World War II, emphasizing that again. World War II badly weakened the traditional powers of Europe, and since Germany didn't really have any overseas colonies, we're talking about here the French, the British especially, but also to a degree the Dutch, even like the Portuguese and other places you don't normally think of as colonial powers. Italy had, of course, been weakened as a losing power in the war. And while the Soviet Union and the U.S. Were definitely seeking to expand their domains and spheres of influence, they did so in an indirect manner. They were not empire builders. The Soviet Union famously railed against imperialism. America has always tried to wash its hands of having an empire. Some of the more interesting conversations I've ever had have been between people who get very angry at the term American imperialism and trying to figure out what exactly we did in the Philippines and Guam and how that compares. And last but not least, the new UN actually gave colonial peoples a forum in which they could make their voices heard, not just in the quiet 100, 200, maybe if it's a crowded meeting, 1,000 people meetings, but through recordings of their speeches, through TV broadcasts, radio broadcasts, writings which would then be published. And the result is, as mass media grows, the discontent of these colonial populations becomes readily apparent to anyone who will listen. And number three, you have colonial leadership. One of my favorite people of the 20th century, by the way, Leopold Senghor. I'm apologetic if I mispronounce his name. He's the first president of Senegal. Really cool dude. Look up more about him. We unfortunately don't have enough time to really do a deep dive into him, but he's really, really cool. Within the colonies themselves, you have this native upper class that was largely male, almost exclusively male, if we're being honest with each other. Who were familiar with that hypocrisy we talked about back in step one, but they were also familiar with European culture. And they craft these very eloquent, very pointed, very, very accurate criticisms of colonialism, and they find an audience in the forms of the large numbers of unemployed, people who had lost their land, veterans who had fought in both world wars for colonies that refused to give them their rights. And the result is that this leadership begins to form a nexus to fuel either independence movements or outright rebellions, depending on where you're talking about. All right, so now we're going to talk about how decolonization looked around the world, and this is basically what we're going to talk about for both today and tomorrow, and it is a wild, wild path for just about everybody. It is very, very, very inconsistent, and we're only going to scratch the surface of that in this course, you guys. I apologize in advance. I think we're going to look at a total of like 6 countries specifically, many of them for only a single slide across today and tomorrow. We really only do a deep dive in India. And I do want you aware of the fact that this is not a comprehensive look at decolonization, and I don't want you to think that it is. This is just some examples you can use if you ever find yourself in a discussion on decolonization, if you ever find yourself struggling to explain why things are the way they are in certain parts of the world. Heck, in some cases, why countries exist at all. Right, so European nations had been preparing to release their African and Asian colonies, but how much preparation they had done varied wildly from place to place. Political reforms, as well as the building of infrastructure, was a thing. It did happen, and a lot of countries did voluntarily leave. We'll talk more about those guys and peaceful, such as it is, decolonization tomorrow. Um, but they still kept their close ties to Europeans. But those reforms also do come from these nationalist movements who have a lot of people, who have a lot of admirers, who are the fathers of their nations. Gandhi is the most famous of India. Here we have a picture of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. Again, apologies for the pronunciation. Famously, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and so on and so forth. I could go on. There's a lot of these individuals. But the short of it is that even in countries that were peacefully released, there were strong nationalist movements, and especially in countries that were violently granted their independence, or were granted their independence after violence. Nationalist movements were really strong there. Okay, so the other thing to remember about these independence movements is that they were largely unified by disdain or dislike for the colonizers. They were not strong, united fronts of, no matter what you read in Gandhi's writing, of all Indians rising up against the British. It was all Indians rising up against the British, but also looking to their left and their right and going, I'm not too sure about these guys either. They are fragile alliances. They're alliances of different social classes, like the castes in India, or different ethnicities, like most of Africa, because you remember how ad hoc those lines were. Different religions, and this system is gonna spell trouble once these nations gain their independence. How do you divide up a nation as ethnically and religiously diverse as India? How do you deal with the fact that there are literally genocidal hatreds in large numbers of sub-Saharan African countries? What do you do about that? How do you divide up that power? How are minorities dealt with? And even in countries where decolonization was handled comparatively well by European powers, they failed to answer those questions, and the people who took power in those vacuums often found horrific answers to those questions. And that is an unfortunate fact that is going to color a lot of history in what we call the global South for the last half of the 20th century. You would do very well to remember that. So, with regards to the variety, I already touched on this a little, but we're going to dive in a little bit more. Why were some nations willingly let go, and why were some nations held on to through violent conflict? And pretty much all countries fell into one of three categories. A lot of them, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, had never seen large-scale European migration. They were ruled from a distance through colonial elites, and they were let go very easily because they were quote-unquote foreign. They were, yeah, we owned them, but let's let them go, was what a lot of Europeans believed. Other nations, like ones we'll talk about tomorrow, like South Africa and Australia, um, had European leadership. The Europeans were the majority in Australia. In South Africa, they represented a very potent minority who were allowed to rule the country through apartheid. And that was good enough for Europeans. They allowed those countries to go because, oh, you've been civilized. But some countries existed in a gray area. They were either too profitable or had too large of a European population to be considered non-white, to be considered foreign. Again, please note the quotes all through that. But there were too many Europeans there to just write them off as foreign, but too few Europeans to just say the country is, that's just that's been Europeanized, that's been civilized, we should let it go. And those are the countries, Vietnam, Algeria, Indonesia, that are going to see really nasty, really violent decolonization. All right, so we're going to notice some themes through all these colonies. The three that we're going to look at, we're only going to look at three specific nations. Indonesia had been taken over by the Japanese during World War II. It's a resource-rich colony, of course, the spices historically, but Indonesia can grow rubber. Indonesia's got oil reserves. Indonesia's got mineral reserves. It's a big country, and it's a prize country to own. And the result of Japanese occupation and giving Indonesians some freedoms was that Indonesia wanted its independence after the Second World War. The Dutch said no, war followed. Almost immediately, too. Depends on who you ask, but most sources put the Indonesian War of Independence starting at the very latest in 1946, so really close after World War II ended. You have about 100,000 Indonesians and Dutch dying in the conflict. Indonesia gains its independence in 1949, but stays under the thumb of various political strongmen or generals throughout the history of the Cold War. We touched on that a little bit in the atrocities section in our last unit. Indonesia doesn't hold a fair election for 44 years, from 1955 to 1999. There's still several problems with Indonesian politics, but it is getting better as the Cold War kind of fades into memory. But Indonesia has to deal with ethnic tension. Indonesia has to deal with religious extremism from hardline Islamist groups in the islands. Indonesia has a lot of stuff to deal with, and again, a lot of that stems from colonial powers pretty much going, all right, you're independent, good luck. Algeria is one of the most famous cases of a country having to decolonize. It was, the numbers I've read vary, but call it about 1/6 ethnically French, people who had moved there. Who wanted to stay a part of France itself, and the rest of the country, more or less, wanted independence. Please understand that this is an oversimplification. The Civil War and War of Revolution in Algeria is one of the more complicated conflicts of the 20th century. But what you really need to know is that France tried its best to hold on to this colony, and the result is, most sources I've found say, the most violent war of independence in and on the African subcontinent. Somewhere in the ballpark of 500,000 people died. Some sources go up to 1 million. When you consider Algeria's comparatively small population and its concentration of its population up in the coastal regions of the country, that is a lot of people. A lot of them are civilians who are killed either by the French or by the Algerian rebels. In France itself, the war actually collapsed the French Fourth Republic and led to the French Fifth Republic, another governmental change for France. And Algeria becomes independent in 1962 after this 8-year war, which leads to an exodus and, in some cases, expulsion of pro-French Algerians. Perhaps the most notable thing, if you look at the photo over off to the side, was at one point in time, Algeria's entire eastern and western borders were lined with barbed wire / electrified fence and landmines. And the landmine cleanup, which pretty much started upon independence in 1962, lasted until 2017. And if you're wondering, the southern border is, of course, just desert, which is much easier to leave open because people will wander off into that and simply die, as well as the northern border being, of course, the Mediterranean Sea. And Vietnam is the last country we'll really look at heavily. If you're going, wait a minute, Indonesia and Vietnam were in some of our previous lessons. Yeah, turns out this thing overlaps. Vietnamese citizens wanted the French to get out since literally the end of the First World War, when Ho Chi Minh actually went to Paris to argue for Vietnamese independence. The Vietnamese started their rebellion early, revolting against the French in 1946. They successfully won. The country was divided. This is again very, very, very complicated. The country's cut into a northern communist portion and a democratic south. Elections are to be held in 1956. Neither side wanted to hold elections, especially the South Vietnamese, as near as we can tell. Intervention by the superpowers takes place, and in the end, again in the shadow of the Cold War, Vietnam becomes a unified communist country in 1975. Communism actually spreads to Cambodia with disastrous effects, as well as Laos with less disastrous but still not exactly wholesome effects. Throughout Southeast Asia, it's a nasty, messy decolonization process. All right, so violent decolonization did take place in a lot of other countries, sometimes successfully after much expenditure of lives and treasure, Mozambique and Angola, for example, and sometimes without success. Kenya experienced the Mau Mau rebellion that did not succeed in gaining their country's independence. Spain's ethnic minority Basque population tried to rebel. That's not fully a decolonization thing, but there's not really a good way for me to put that. In the Cold War, of course, a lot of these newly independent nations almost immediately go into either the US, Soviet, or Chinese sphere. Some, as we've talked about, tried to maintain some degree of autonomy in the non-aligned movement. And a lot of these countries wind up fighting further wars, a lot of times civil wars, over ethnicity, over religion, over suppression of opposition parties, a combination of the three. Resources are really problematic, unfortunately. But if there is a silver lining, and you know this isn't normally how I roll, if there is a silver lining, you know that this decolonization does create independent states, which is objectively better than being colonized and being trampled upon, so long as your government is competent. The other thing is, and this is probably the bigger silver lining, that this violent decolonization also creates a distaste for colonial wars. A lot of countries are able to peacefully negotiate their release because Europeans saw the cost of trying to maintain that empire, the cost in lives, the cost in political capital, the cost of simply money. And we'll talk more about what happens to these independent nations a little further down the line. Thanks for sticking with. Good to have you back. We'll see you in the future.